June 7, 1943, RAF, Ludford Magna, Lincolnshire, England. Flight Sergeant Max Goldstein adjusts his headphones in the cramped rear compartment of Lancaster bomber ED-588. Around him, banks of radio equipment hum with electrical tension. 3 powerful transmitters, a specialized receiver, and a cathode ray screen that glows green in the darkness. Outside, 23 other Lancasters from 101 Squadron taxi toward the runway, their distinctive 7-foot radio masts jutting skyward like electronic spears. What the other bomber crews don't know, what even most of 101 Squadron doesn't fully understand, is that Goldstein and his fellow operators are about to deploy a weapon so revolutionary that it will fundamentally change aerial warfare forever. A weapon that exists not in the physical realm of bullets and bombs, but in the invisible battlefield of radio frequencies, a weapon the RAF calls airborne cigar. Tonight's target is Cologne. 783 heavy bombers will cross the North Sea, penetrate German airspace, and face the most sophisticated air defense system ever constructed. The Kamhuba line, a network of radar stations, searchlights, flak batteries and night fighters that stretches from Denmark to France. German controllers will vector Messerschmitt Bf-110s and Junkers Ju-88s into the bomber stream with deadly precision, using very high-frequency radio communications to coordinate attacks that have been slaughtering RAF crews for months. But tonight will be different. Tonight, Max Goldstein will prove that the most devastating weapon in modern warfare isn't made of steel or explosives. It's made of electromagnetic waves, carefully tuned frequencies, and the audacity to turn the enemy's own communications network against them. What Goldstein doesn't know, as he runs through his pre-flight checks, is that his unauthorized modifications to the airborne cigar system violate direct orders from RAF headquarters. What he doesn't know is that his technique for jamming German fighter controllers will be declared too dangerous, too provocative, too effective. What he doesn't know is that within 6 months, his methods will be officially banned by the same commanders who are about to discover they cannot win this war without them. The story begins 3 months earlier in the workshops of the telecommunications research establishment at Malvern. Dr. Robert Cockburn, the brilliant physicist leading Britain's electronic warfare program, stares at intelligence reports that make his blood run cold. German night fighter effectiveness has increased 340% since January. RAF Bomber Command is losing aircraft at unsustainable rates. Something must be done, and conventional solutions aren't working. The problem is elegantly simple and brutally complex. German ground controllers communicate with their night fighters using very high-frequency radio, typically between 38 and 42 megahertz. These controllers sit in concrete bunkers scattered across occupied Europe, watching radar screens that show approaching bomber formations as clusters of green dots. When they spot a raid, they broadcast precise instructions to their fighter pilots. Vector 280 degrees, climb to 18,000 feet, enemy formation bearing northeast, 40 kilometers distant. The Luftwaffe's system is devastatingly effective because it's centralized and coordinated. One controller can direct multiple fighters simultaneously, creating a web of interceptions that tears through bomber formations like invisible claws. RAF losses in March 1943 exceed 400 aircraft. At this rate, Bomber Command will cease to exist as an effective force within 8 months. Cockburn's team at TRE has already developed several countermeasures. Window strips of metallized paper that create false radar returns confuses German radar operators. Tinsel, engine noise broadcast on German radio frequencies, disrupts some communications. But these are passive measures, defensive responses to German initiative. What Cockburn needs is something aggressive, something that seizes control of the electromagnetic battlefield. The concept for airborne cigar emerges from a simple observation. German night fighters are useless without ground control. Luftwaffe pilots flying in darkness over blacked-out countryside cannot find bomber formations through visual contact alone. They depend entirely on radio instructions from controllers who can see the tactical picture on radar screens. Sever that communication link, and the most advanced night fighter becomes as helpless as a blind man in a maze. But jamming VHF communications from the ground is ineffective. Radio waves at these frequencies travel in straight lines, limited by the horizon. Ground-based jammers in England cannot reach German controllers operating deep inside occupied territory. The solution requires putting jamming equipment inside the bomber formations themselves, close enough to overwhelm German transmissions with electronic noise. The technical challenges are immense. VHF transmitters powerful enough to jam enemy communications weigh hundreds of pounds and consume enormous amounts of electrical power. Fitting such equipment into operational bombers requires removing guns, reducing bomb loads, and accepting performance penalties that make the aircraft more vulnerable to attack. Worse, The jamming transmitters themselves become beacons that German direction-finding equipment can track and target. Dr. Cockburn's engineers work through the winter of 1942 to 43, designing a system that balances effectiveness against survivability. The final configuration consists of three 50-watt transmitters operating through two 7-foot antenna masts mounted above the aircraft's wing, plus a specialized receiver with its own antenna near the tail. The system weighs 400 pounds, requires a dedicated operator, and reduces the bomber's defensive armament by removing the mid-upper gun turret. More importantly, the system requires operators who understand German. The jamming isn't automatic. Someone must listen to German radio traffic, identify which frequencies the controllers are using, then manually tune the transmitters to block those specific channels. When the Germans change frequencies, which they do constantly, the operator must detect the switch immediately and follow them to the new channel. Finding qualified personnel proves nearly as challenging as building the equipment. The Royal Air Force needs radio operators who combine technical expertise with fluency in German, men willing to fly night after night into the most heavily defended airspace in Europe while operating complex electronic equipment under combat conditions. Many of the volunteers are Jewish refugees who fled Germany before the war, men with personal motivations for disrupting Nazi operations that go far beyond military duty. Flight Sergeant Max Goldstein is one of these men. Born in Hamburg in 1919, he emigrated to London with his family in 1935 as the Nazi persecution intensified. He joins the RAF in 1940, trains as a radio operator, and volunteers for special duties when recruiters arrive at his base looking for German speakers. What they don't tell him is that airborne cigar operators have the highest casualty rate in Bomber Command. The first ABC-equipped Lancasters begin operations in October 1943 with 101 Squadron. The initial results are promising but limited. German controllers adapt quickly to jamming, switching frequencies when they detect interference, using code words to identify legitimate transmissions, employing women controllers whose voices are harder for male operators to imitate convincingly. But Goldstein notices something the engineers at TRE missed. German fighter controllers don't just issue tactical instructions, they provide constant commentary, describing what they see on their radar screens, speculating about bomber intentions, coordinating with other controllers across the defensive network. This chatter contains intelligence that could be invaluable if someone were listening carefully enough to understand it. More importantly, Goldstein realizes that jamming isn't the only way to disrupt German communications. What if instead of blocking their transmissions, he could corrupt them? What if he could feed false information into their network, sending German fighters to empty patches of sky while the real bombers flew unmolested toward their targets? The technique Goldstein develops violates every protocol in the airborne cigar operations manual. Instead of immediately jamming German frequencies when he finds them, he listens. He learns the controllers' voices, their call signs, their tactical procedures. He memorizes the radio discipline that German pilots expect to hear from their ground controllers. Then, at critical moments during bomber runs, he begins transmitting his own instructions. Vector 90 degrees. He broadcasts in perfect German. Bandits heading southeast, 15 kilometers. His accent is flawless, his technical terminology precise. German pilots, hearing what sounds like legitimate instructions from their controllers, obediently turn away from the actual bomber formations. By the time the real controllers realize their frequencies have been compromised and order course corrections, the bombers are past the interception point and heading home. The results are dramatic. On missions where Goldstein employs his deception techniques, 101 Squadron's losses drop by 60%. Bomber formations protected by his false broadcasts reach their targets with minimal fighter interference. Intelligence reports indicate that German controllers are becoming paranoid, no longer trusting their own radio networks, spending precious minutes authenticating every transmission while bombers escape into the darkness. But Goldstein's methods create a new problem. His transmissions are longer and more complex than simple jamming, giving German direction-finding stations more time to triangulate his position. His Lancaster becomes a priority target for every night fighter in the area. The aircraft's distinctive antenna configuration already makes it conspicuous, but Goldstein's extended broadcast periods turn it into a beacon that screams its location across the electromagnetic spectrum. RAF headquarters becomes aware of Goldstein's techniques through post-mission debriefings and intelligence analysis. The initial reaction is alarm. Goldstein is exceeding his authority, improvising tactics that haven't been approved by command, potentially compromising the entire airborne cigar program if the Germans develop effective countermeasures. More seriously, his deception broadcasts might violate international agreements governing legitimate combatants if captured German pilots claim they were misled by false communications. Group Captain Addison Beaverbrook, commanding officer of 101 Squadron, faces an impossible choice. Goldstein's methods are producing unprecedented results, protecting bomber crews and ensuring mission success rates that exceed every projection. But those same methods are unauthorized, potentially illegal, and certainly dangerous for the operators employing them. Should he order Goldstein to return to standard jamming procedures, accepting higher losses but maintaining operational security? Or should he allow the innovations to continue, knowing that each mission brings his most effective operator closer to inevitable destruction? The decision becomes more urgent when German intelligence begins adapting to Goldstein's tactics. Luftwaffe controllers start using authentication codes that change hourly, making deception broadcasts more difficult. They employ multiple frequencies simultaneously, forcing jamming operators to choose which channels to block. Most ominously, they begin using Goldstein's own techniques against him, broadcasting false instructions to confuse RAF crews about target locations and timing. The electronic warfare escalates rapidly through the autumn of 1943. What began as simple radio jamming evolves into something resembling aerial chess played at light speed across the electromagnetic spectrum. Goldstein and his fellow operators find themselves fighting battles that exist only in radio frequencies, where victory is measured not in destroyed aircraft but in confused enemy transmissions and successful bomber runs. October 14, 1943. Goldstein sits in his cramped compartment aboard Lancaster ED-588, monitoring German fighter control frequencies as the bomber stream approaches Stuttgart. Through his headphones, he hears the familiar voice of Hauptmann Klaus Weber, a Luftwaffe controller, whose distinctive Bavarian accent Goldstein has learned to recognize over weeks of intercepts. Weber is coordinating 6 Messerschmitt Bf-110s into attack positions, his calm professional tone betraying none of the deadly consequences his words will unleash. Adlergruppe, vector 240 degrees, climb to 6,000 meters, enemy formation bearing northwest, estimated 80 aircraft. Goldstein's fingers hover over his transmitter controls. Standard procedure dictates that he should jam Weber's frequency immediately, flooding it with electronic noise that would make communication impossible. But Goldstein has learned that brute force jamming triggers immediate countermeasures. The Germans simply switch to backup frequencies and continue their intercepts, while his transmitters reveal his position to every direction-finding station within 200 kilometers. Instead, Goldstein waits. He listens as Weber vectors his fighters closer to the bomber formation, tracking their progress on his own equipment while calculating the optimal moment to intervene. When the German fighters are approximately 3 minutes from intercept, Goldstein keys his transmitter and speaks in Weber's exact accent and cadence. Adlergruppe, disregard previous vector, new contacts bearing 180 degrees, priority target, descend to 4,000 meters immediately. The response is immediate. 6 German fighters, trained to obey ground control without question, abandon their intercept course and dive toward empty sky 50 kilometers south of the actual bomber formation. Weber's voice erupts across the frequency seconds later, shouting contradictory orders as he realizes his network has been compromised. But the damage is done. By the time the German fighters regain proper vectors, the bombers are past the danger zone and approaching their target. What Goldstein doesn't realize is that his transmission has been recorded by German intelligence stations across occupied Europe. Wehrmacht cryptographers are analyzing his voice patterns, his tactical vocabulary, his technical German expressions. They're building a profile of the enemy operator who has been systematically disrupting their air defense network, and they're developing countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize his techniques. November 3, 1943. The counterstrike comes without warning. As Goldstein monitors German frequencies during a raid on Dusseldorf, he hears something that makes his blood freeze. His own voice, speaking perfect German, broadcasting false instructions to RAF bomber crews. The Germans have recorded his transmissions, analyzed his speech patterns, and are now using German operators with similar vocal characteristics to impersonate him. RAF bomber formations. This is your escort controller. Vector 090 degrees immediately. Heavy fighter concentrations ahead. Repeat, turn east to avoid interception. The broadcast is technically perfect, delivered in German-accented English that mimics the radio procedures used by RAF fighter controllers. Goldstein watches in horror as several bomber formations begin turning eastward, directly into a trap where German night fighters wait in ambush. He keys his own transmitter, broadcasting warnings in English, but the damage spreads faster than he can contain it. Confusion ripples through the bomber stream as crews struggle to determine which radio instructions are legitimate. The electronic deception battle becomes a hall of mirrors, where nothing can be trusted. German operators impersonate British controllers, while British operators impersonate German controllers. Radio frequencies that should carry tactical information instead broadcast a cacophony of contradictory orders, false vectors, and deliberate misinformation. Both sides employ increasingly sophisticated authentication procedures, but these consume precious time during critical moments when seconds determine whether bombers reach their targets or spiral into German forests. RAF intelligence officers studying post-mission reports identify a disturbing pattern. German direction-finding networks are becoming more efficient at locating airborne cigar transmissions. Aircraft employing Goldstein's deception techniques are suffering casualty rates 40% higher than those using standard jamming procedures. The longer transmissions required for convincing impersonation give German triangulation stations multiple fixes on each aircraft, creating targeting data that night fighter pilots use to vector directly onto ABC-equipped bombers. Group Captain Beaverbrook receives the casualty statistics during a classified briefing at RAF High Wycombe. The numbers are stark and undeniable. Of the 12 operators trained in Goldstein's deception techniques, 7 have been shot down in the past month. The survivors report increasingly aggressive German fighter attacks, with enemy aircraft appearing to know exactly where to find ABC-equipped Lancasters despite window chaff and other countermeasures. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, commander of RAF Bomber Command, reviews the intelligence reports with growing alarm. The airborne cigar program was supposed to protect his bombers, not turn them into magnets for enemy fighters. Yet the tactical effectiveness of Goldstein's methods cannot be disputed. Bomber formations protected by his false broadcasts consistently achieve higher target success rates with fewer losses to German interception. The dilemma reaches crisis proportions when ultra-intercepts reveal German plans for Operation Steinbock, a massive night fighter offensive designed specifically to counter airborne cigar operations. Luftwaffe intelligence has identified the approximate number of ABC-equipped aircraft, their distinctive antenna configurations, and their operational patterns. German fighter pilots are being trained to recognize the electronic signatures of jamming transmissions and use them for targeting rather than avoidance. December 12, 1943. Goldstein receives orders that change everything. RAF headquarters has decided that deception broadcasts represent an unacceptable operational risk. All airborne cigar operators are directed to return to standard jamming procedures immediately. No more voice impersonation. No more false tactical instructions. The electromagnetic battlefield will be contested through brute force interference rather than sophisticated deception. Goldstein reads the directive 3 times before its implications fully register. The techniques he has developed over months of combat operations, methods that have saved hundreds of bomber crew lives and ensured mission success rates exceeding every projection, are being officially banned by the same commanders who benefited from their effectiveness. The reasoning behind the ban extends beyond simple casualty statistics. RAF legal advisors have raised concerns about the legitimacy of deception broadcasts under international warfare conventions. If captured German pilots can demonstrate they were misled by false radio communications, they might claim that their attackers violated the rules of legitimate combat. More pragmatically, the Germans are adapting their procedures faster than the British can develop new countermeasures. But the most compelling argument for ending deception operations comes from signals intelligence. Ultra-decrypts indicate that German research teams are developing automated direction-finding equipment specifically designed to track extended radio transmissions. The new systems can triangulate broadcasting positions within seconds rather than minutes, providing targeting data accurate enough for radar-guided flak batteries. Every deception broadcast threatens to become a death sentence for the aircraft making it. Goldstein faces the same impossible choice confronting commanders throughout the RAF. Should he obey orders that will reduce his effectiveness but increase his survival chances? Or should he continue using techniques that protect bomber formations while making his own aircraft a priority target for every German fighter and flak battery within range? The decision becomes more complex when Goldstein learns that other ABC operators are quietly ignoring the ban. Flight Sergeant David Rosen, flying with 101 Squadron's B Flight, continues using modified deception techniques during missions over the Ruhr Valley. Sergeant Hans Müller, a German refugee operating with 214 Squadron, has developed new impersonation methods that German controllers haven't yet learned to recognize. These operators argue that their oath as Royal Air Force personnel requires them to use every available method to protect their fellow aircrew and ensure mission success. If superior officers lack the technical understanding to appreciate the effectiveness of deception broadcasts, that doesn't absolve individual operators from the moral obligation to employ their specialized skills in defense of bomber formations. The unauthorized continuation of deception operations creates a dangerous precedent. Individual radio operators are making tactical decisions that affect entire bomber streams, exceeding their authority and potentially compromising operational security. Yet their results consistently demonstrate the superiority of aggressive electronic warfare techniques over passive jamming methods. January 8, 1944. The consequences of divided electronic warfare doctrine become apparent During a disastrous raid on Brunswick, half the ABC operators follow orders and employ standard jamming procedures. The other half ignore the ban and continue using deception broadcasts. The mixed approach creates coordination problems that German controllers exploit ruthlessly. When Goldstein jams a frequency using electronic noise, Sergeant Müller simultaneously broadcasts false instructions on the same channel. German controllers, trained to recognize jamming patterns, immediately switch to backup frequencies. But they haven't developed procedures for handling simultaneous jamming and deception on multiple channels. The result is electromagnetic chaos that disrupts both German and British communications. Bomber formations receive contradictory navigation instructions from sources they cannot authenticate. German fighter pilots hear overlapping tactical orders from controllers they cannot identify. The radio spectrum becomes a battlefield where information itself is the primary weapon, and both sides struggle to distinguish legitimate signals from electronic warfare attacks. The Brunswick raid losses exceed projections by 300%. 37 bombers fail to return, including 5 ABC-equipped Lancasters, whose operators died while broadcasting deception signals that German direction-finding networks tracked with lethal precision. Post-mission analysis reveals that the mixed jamming and deception operations created targeting opportunities that neither technique would have produced independently. Air Marshal Harris convenes an emergency conference to address the electronic warfare crisis. Senior intelligence officers, telecommunications experts, and operational commanders gather at RAF High Wycombe to determine whether airborne cigar operations should continue, be modified, or be terminated entirely. The stakes extend far beyond individual aircraft losses to the fundamental viability of strategic bombing as a war-winning strategy. The conference room at RAF High Wycombe fills with cigarette smoke and tension as Britain's electronic warfare experts grapple with an unprecedented crisis. Dr. Robert Cockburn spreads intercepted German documents across the mahogany table, his usually steady hands trembling slightly as he points to reconnaissance photographs of modified Luftwaffe night fighters. The images show aircraft equipped with new antenna arrays, direction-finding equipment sophisticated enough to track radio transmissions with pinpoint accuracy. "Gentlemen," Cockburn begins, his voice barely above a whisper, "the Germans have weaponized our own success against us." Group Captain Beaverbrook studies the photographs with growing unease. The German modifications are elegant and terrifying. Messerschmitt Bf-110s now carry automated triangulation systems that can locate broadcasting aircraft within seconds of transmission. The equipment turns every deception broadcast into a targeting beacon, every extended transmission into a death sentence for the operator making it. Wing Commander Charles Patterson, the signals intelligence liaison, drops a bombshell that changes everything. Ultra intercepts reveal that German research stations have recorded over 200 hours of ABC deception broadcasts. Wehrmacht cryptographers are analyzing speech patterns, identifying individual operators, building psychological profiles that will allow them to predict tactical behavior during future engagements. "They know our people better than we do," Patterson explains grimly. Goldstein's voice patterns, Muller's tactical preferences, Rosen's timing sequences. The Germans can anticipate their moves before they make them. The revelation hits the room like a physical blow. The men who developed airborne cigar as Britain's secret weapon suddenly realize they've created a double-edged sword that threatens to destroy the very forces it was designed to protect. Every innovation that made ABC effective has been turned against them by an enemy who learned to exploit their strengths. Air Marshal Harris stands at the head of the table, his weathered face reflecting the weight of impossible decisions. Bomber Command is hemorrhaging aircraft at unsustainable rates, but the cure may be worse than the disease. ABC operations have become a deadly gamble where success breeds vulnerability and effectiveness creates targeting opportunities for increasingly sophisticated German countermeasures. "How many operators do we have left?" Harris asks quietly. The answer chills everyone present. Of the original 47 men trained for airborne cigar operations, 23 are dead, 6 are missing in action, and 8 are grounded with wounds or psychological trauma from repeated exposure to combat conditions that would break ordinary aircrew. The remaining 10 operators continue flying missions despite casualty rates that exceed 60% over 6 months of operations. Squadron leader James Mitchell, the ABC program coordinator, presents statistics that tell the story in stark mathematical terms. Standard jamming operations result in 12% aircraft losses per mission. Deception broadcasts increase losses to 31% per mission for the transmitting aircraft, but reduce overall bomber stream casualties by 40%. The moral calculus is brutal. Sacrifice ABC operators to save bomber crews, or abandon the most effective electronic warfare technique ever developed. The debate that follows reveals fundamental disagreements about the nature of warfare itself. Some officers argue that individual sacrifice for collective benefit represents the essence of military duty. Others contend that ordering men to employ tactics with known 60% casualty rates violates the basic obligation of command to preserve their subordinates' lives whenever possible. Flight Lieutenant Christopher Davies, recently returned from operations with 101 Squadron, provides the perspective of men actually flying the missions. His testimony is devastating in its simplicity. BC operators know they're flying death sentences every night, but they continue because they can see the results. Bomber formations, protected by their transmissions, return with fewer empty bunks, fewer letters to write to grieving families, fewer friends who simply vanish into German darkness. "Sir," Davies says, addressing Harris directly, "the lads aren't asking for safer tactics. They're asking for permission to use the tactics that work." The statement crystallizes the central dilemma. Military effectiveness demands aggressive electronic warfare techniques that maximize operator casualties. Military ethics prohibits ordering subordinates to employ methods with predetermined fatal outcomes. The contradiction cannot be resolved through policy directives or operational procedures. Dr. Cockburn presents the technical analysis that will determine ABC's future. German direction-finding networks now achieve triangulation accuracy within 500 meters, sufficient for radar-directed flak batteries to engage broadcasting aircraft with devastating effectiveness. Modified night fighters carry homing equipment that can track extended transmissions from ranges exceeding 50 kilometers. Every deception broadcast becomes a homing beacon that draws enemy forces like moths to flame. But the intelligence also reveals German vulnerabilities that aggressive operators can exploit. Wehrmacht communication networks rely on rigid procedures that break down when flooded with contradictory information. Fighter pilots trained to obey ground control without question become paralyzed when they cannot distinguish legitimate instructions from deception broadcasts. The electromagnetic battlefield remains winnable if British operators accept the personal costs of victory. The meeting's climax comes when Harris receives an urgent telegram from Downing Street. Prime Minister Churchill has been briefed on ABC casualty rates and operational effectiveness. The political leadership faces the same impossible choice as military commanders: authorize continued operations that sacrifice specialist personnel for strategic advantage, or abandon techniques that might determine the war's outcome. Churchill's message is characteristically direct: continue operations, accept casualties, win war. Harris reads the telegram aloud, then looks around the table at men who will implement decisions that will kill their subordinates. The weight of command has never felt heavier. They are ordering brave men to fly missions with predetermined fatal outcomes, justifying the sacrifice through mathematical calculations about overall casualties and strategic effectiveness. The compromise solution reflects military bureaucracy at its most cynical. BC operations will continue, but deception broadcasts are officially prohibited. Individual operators may employ whatever techniques they deem necessary for mission success, but they do so without authorization, guidance, or official support. If they survive, their methods might be incorporated into formal doctrine. If they die, their innovations die with them. Goldstein receives the new directives through his squadron commander, who delivers them with visible reluctance. The message is clear: continue saving bomber crews, but don't expect recognition, support, or survival. Use whatever methods work, but accept full responsibility for the consequences. The RAF will benefit from your effectiveness while denying your existence. January 15, 1944. Goldstein sits in his quarters at Ludford Magna, writing a letter he hopes will never be sent. Like many ABC operators, he has prepared final messages for family members, documents that explain why he continued flying missions despite knowing the statistical inevitability of his death. The letters represent a peculiar form of courage, the willingness to die for strangers who will never know their names. "My dear mother," he writes, "if you are reading this, then the work is finished, and I didn't survive to explain it myself. I want you to understand that everything I did was necessary. The bombers needed protection that only we could provide. The methods were dangerous, but the alternative was watching good men die while we had the knowledge to save them." The letter continues for 3 pages, explaining technical details of electronic warfare that his mother will never understand, justifying tactical decisions that resulted in his death, expressing love for family members he will never see again. It's the testament of a man who chose duty over survival, effectiveness over safety, anonymous sacrifice over personal preservation. Similar letters fill the personal effects of ABC operators across Bomber Command. Men who accepted certain death to protect colleagues they barely knew, who developed innovations under combat conditions while knowing that success would make them priority targets for increasingly sophisticated German countermeasures. Their legacy exists not in official recognition but in the empty bunks that would have been filled without their sacrifice. February 3, 1944. The validation of their sacrifice comes during the most ambitious deception operation ever attempted. Intelligence reports indicate that the Germans are concentrating their night fighter reserves for a massive assault on the next major bomber raid. Luftwaffe commanders have identified patterns in ABC operations and plan to exploit them by targeting jamming aircraft with coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Goldstein and 7 other ABC operators receive special briefings for what everyone knows will be a suicide mission. Their task is to broadcast continuously during the bomber stream's approach to Berlin, drawing German fighters away from the main formations while accepting the inevitable consequences of extended transmission periods. The plan requires them to make themselves irresistible targets, while the bombers they're protecting slip past German defenses. The operators volunteer unanimously, not because they harbor death wishes or seek posthumous glory, but because they understand that their specialized knowledge can save hundreds of lives if applied correctly. They have become weapons in the most literal sense, tools designed for single use, effective only through their own destruction. The Berlin raid launches on schedule despite weather conditions that would normally scrub operations. Cloud cover extends from ground level to 15,000 feet, creating navigation problems that force bomber crews to rely entirely on radio guidance. The atmospheric conditions that make flying dangerous also provide perfect concealment for electronic warfare operations. Goldstein's Lancaster takes position at the head of the bomber stream, its distinctive antenna array broadcasting deception signals that flood German frequencies with contradictory tactical information. Behind him, 7 other ABC aircraft spread throughout the formation, creating a web of electronic confusion that renders German ground control nearly useless. The German response is immediate and devastating. Night fighters equipped with direction-finding equipment vector directly onto the broadcasting aircraft, ignoring the main bomber formations to focus on the electronic warfare specialists. The sky fills with tracer fire as Messerschmitt Bf-110s attack targets they can locate precisely through radio triangulation. Goldstein continues broadcasting even as cannon shells tear through his aircraft's fuselage. His deception transmissions guide German fighters away from the main bomber formations, while his own Lancaster becomes the center of an aerial battle that will determine whether 800 British aircrew survive the night. The mathematics of sacrifice have never been more stark. 8 men dying to save hundreds. The battle rages across 200 miles of German airspace as ABC operators fight their last engagement. Radio frequencies that should carry tactical communications instead broadcast the final transmissions of men who chose duty over survival, effectiveness over safety, anonymous heroism over personal preservation. Their voices fade one by one as German fighters find their targets, until only silence remains where once the electromagnetic spectrum crackled with defiant innovation. The main bomber formations reach Berlin with minimal losses, protected by the sacrifice of men whose names will never appear in official histories. The strategic bombing campaign continues because 8 radio operators accepted certain death to ensure its success. The electronic warfare revolution proceeds because anonymous heroes proved that individual courage could overcome any technological disadvantage, but their sacrifice raises questions that military commanders cannot answer. How many specialists can be expended for strategic advantage before the expertise disappears entirely? How many irreplaceable operators can die before the techniques die with them? The ABC program faces extinction not through enemy action but through the success of its own methods. February 4, 1944. The morning after the Berlin raid brings grim confirmations and unexpected revelations. All 8 ABC aircraft failed to return, their crews joining the growing list of electronic warfare casualties. But ultra-intercepts reveal that German controllers spent the entire night chasing electronic phantoms, while the real bombers struck their targets unmolested. The deception worked perfectly, at the cost of everyone who made it possible. Group Captain Beaverbrook reviews the operational reports with mixed emotions. The tactical success cannot be disputed, but the human cost raises fundamental questions about the sustainability of electronic warfare operations. Britain has achieved electromagnetic superiority by sacrificing the very specialists who created it, winning battles while losing the knowledge needed to fight future ones. The paradox of ABC operations becomes clear in the weeks following the Berlin raid. The techniques developed by Goldstein and his colleagues remain devastatingly effective against German air defenses, but no one survives who understands how to employ them properly. The institutional knowledge dies with the operators, leaving behind equipment without expertise, capability without comprehension. March 1944 brings desperate attempts to rebuild the ABC program with new personnel and modified procedures. Fresh operators train on equipment they don't fully understand, learning techniques from training manuals written by dead men. The results are predictably inferior to the innovations developed under combat conditions by operators who combine technical knowledge with tactical experience. The new ABC crews achieve modest success with conservative jamming procedures, but they lack the intuitive understanding of German psychology that enabled effective deception broadcasts. They can disrupt enemy communications but cannot manipulate them, can create interference but cannot exploit it, can survive longer but protect fewer bombers than their predecessors. The electromagnetic battlefield evolves rapidly as German countermeasures become increasingly sophisticated. Direction-finding networks achieve near-instantaneous triangulation of radio transmissions. Night fighters carry automated homing equipment that requires no human operator to track broadcasting aircraft. The technological arms race accelerates beyond the ability of individual innovation to influence its outcome. Yet the legacy of ABC operations extends far beyond their immediate tactical impact. The techniques developed by Goldstein and his colleagues established the foundation for modern electronic warfare, demonstrating that electromagnetic dominance can be more decisive than conventional firepower. Their sacrifice proves that specialized knowledge, properly applied, can overcome any technological disadvantage through individual courage and tactical innovation. April 1944. The official history of airborne cigar operations will never be written because most of its contents remain classified decades after the war's end. The men who died developing electronic warfare techniques will receive no public recognition because acknowledging their existence would reveal capabilities that remain militarily sensitive. They become the anonymous heroes of a secret war fought in radio frequencies rather than physical battlefields. But their influence shapes every subsequent conflict, where electromagnetic spectrum dominance determines tactical outcomes. Modern military communications, radar jamming, and electronic countermeasures trace their lineage directly to innovations developed by operators who died perfecting them. The techniques that seemed impossibly sophisticated in 1944 became the foundation for electronic warfare systems that define contemporary military operations. The banned methods that cost so many lives eventually became standard doctrine, implemented with improved equipment and better training procedures. The sacrifice of individual specialists enabled the development of systematic approaches that reduced casualties while maintaining effectiveness. The knowledge purchased with blood became the basis for techniques that saved countless lives in future conflicts. The validation of their sacrifice becomes undeniable when post-war intelligence reveals the true scope of what Goldstein and his fellow operators achieved. German records, captured intact from Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin, tell a story that Allied commanders never fully understood during the war itself. The deception broadcasts that cost so many ABC operators their lives didn't just disrupt individual missions, they shattered the entire foundation of German air defense doctrine. Oberst Heinrich Schmidt, the Wehrmacht's chief night fighter coordinator, wrote in his classified after-action report dated March 15, 1944, "The enemy's radio deception operations have rendered our ground control system unreliable to the point of operational collapse. Controllers no longer trust their own networks. Pilots hesitate to obey tactical instructions. The psychological impact exceeds the technical disruption by orders of magnitude." The captured documents reveal that German High Command diverted over 7,000 radio specialists from other critical projects to counter ABC operations alone. Engineers who should have been developing V-2 rockets instead spent months analyzing recorded transmissions from dead British operators. Scientists who might have advanced jet fighter technology wasted precious resources building countermeasures against techniques that evolved faster than they could comprehend them. The banned hack that started with Max Goldstein's unauthorized voice impersonations became the blueprint for every electronic warfare system that followed. His techniques, officially prohibited yet secretly employed, saved thousands of bomber crews while costing the lives of the specialists who perfected them. The electromagnetic battlefield he helped create still exists today, fought by operators whose names we'll never know, using methods that trace directly back to a Jewish refugee who refused to let good men die while he possessed the knowledge to save them.